Welcome to Location Filmmaking, Camera and Lenses Part 2. So what we're going to talk about today is depth of field. So what is depth of field? Hello Kitty. So depth of field basically is, what it means is that it is the area within the distance that all the objects in that same area is entirely in focus. Okay? So to elaborate further, let's look at this video.
Due to the way optics work, the wider the iris opening, the shallower the depth of field is in an image. Depth of field refers to how much of an image your lens can focus on at one time. If your lens can focus both near and far at the same time, you have a deep depth of field. If only near or only far, it has a shallow depth of field. Since an out-of-focus background can help you draw focus on your subject, a shallow depth of field is usually desired. So opening your iris to its widest setting, usually f1.8, will allow you to get the most shallow depth of field and draw focus to certain areas of your image.
So, what it really means is that in order for you to control depth of field, so pretend that this is your camera and you have a lot of objects right in front, okay? And this area is depth of field. Now, in order to have this area all the way to this area, totally this whole length here to be very, very sharp or all in focus, your aperture or your iris in your camera must go to f22. Remember, a very large number means it's a small opening. So a smaller opening, a lot of area will be sharp. Now, in order to only manipulate small little areas to be sharp, okay, you can do so by opening up the iris. So you need to turn your iris to maybe f4 or f2 or f1.4, then only a small area to be sharp. Then this part can be blur and this part can be blur. And you can actually shift this whole area from here to here, and this one will be sharp and this whole part will be blur. That's how they actually manipulate the camera lenses when they're doing a show between two people talking, or maybe an object that you want to focus from here to maybe all the way behind. So one of the best examples to show you is this slide. Now if you look at this lens, okay, now this is a 28mm lens, means it's actually a wide angle lens because the focal length is very, very short. Now if I'm going to use a wide angle lens and I'm going to use try to make it have a very shallow depth of field, that means an area that is only very small that I can actually manipulate the focus. I can't do it because a wide angle will make everything sharp from here all the way to the back. Okay, it will make everything sharp. I cannot manipulate the area of focus. The only way I can do it is that I need to change the lens to a zoom lens. Now in the camera that we're going to be introducing to you for location filmmaking, for you to do a shallow depth of field, you need to zoom in. You cannot zoom out. Alright, so you zoom in, you create a zoom-like effect, and then you increase your aperture to a very wide setting like f1.4 or f2. Then you can manipulate the image. You can have a part that is sharp and everything that is blur. Okay, so similarly for this example, if you look at this, if I have an f2 opening, I can manipulate her to be sharp and everything to be out of focus. The moment I shift to f22, everything is sharp, including her and the background. So I cannot separate her from the sharpness of the background. So how does this actually bother you when you're trying to shoot something? It's something to do with not only the aperture but something to do with focal length. So let's look at what focal length is all about.
Behold the lens. You know, it's easy to take this little tube of expensive glass for granted, but a lens does a lot more than just focus light onto a film stock. A lens's focal length has a great effect on the look and the composition of the shot, and the effects offered by a particular lens can be used by the filmmaker to shape our experience of the subject or situation on screen. Focal length just means the distance between the optical center of the lens and the film plane where the image is focused onto the film. Right now, we're shooting with a 16mm camera using a lens with a 25mm focal length, which is in the middle of the road normal zone that approximates the way our own lenses, otherwise known as eyeballs, see and experience the world in terms of
depth of field,
movement, and perspective.
Right. So let's start with perspective. Perspective simply means the way objects appear in relation to one another in depth. Corey back there, and Max in the middle, are farther away and are thus smaller than Shelley, who's just a few feet from the camera. How about some coffee, Shelley?
thanks.
Anyway, you have a pretty good idea how far they are from each other because of your intuitive understanding of relative size. We know that Max is about 30 feet behind Shelley, and Corey is another 100 feet back because of how big Shelley is in comparison with them. But we can mess with perspective just by changing the focal length of the lens. We'll throw in a 9mm lens, which has a much shorter focal length than the 25mm we were just looking at. With a short lens, otherwise known as a wide-angle lens, depth is stretched. That's because short focal length exaggerates the effects of
Perspective!
Right. Teeny tiny fuzzy Corey back there looks much farther away than he actually is, and the perceived distance between all three subjects appears much greater than it actually is. But if we switch to a telephoto lens with a long focal length like this 120mm, Corey, Max, and Shelley all look much closer together now. Why? Because their relative size and frame is pretty similar. Long lenses compress depth, negating the effects of
Perspective! Hey! What about depth of field?
Well, depth of field refers to the depth, or space, in front of the camera, and what portion of it is in focus. You'll notice that Corey way back there and Shelley up front are both out of focus. That's because a long lens has a much narrower depth of field, and right now Max is the one occupying that little slice of focus. Of course, by adjusting our focus ring, we can move that slice of focus wherever we want it. Well, you'll have to wait because it's time to demonstrate how focal length affects movement through depth. But first we'll have to change back to a medium-length lens that approximates human vision. This shorter lens has not only greater depth of field, but delivers a pretty normal view of movement through depth. As our stars cross the bridge, they get closer and thus larger at a rate which matches our expectation of how the perspective of a walking subject should shift as it approaches us.
Where's the cooler?
Here, the space stretching effect of this short lens makes the bridge seem much longer. So, as they approach, the exaggerated depth effect makes it seem like they're covering more space than they actually are, which increases the apparent speed of their movement, which gets even more exaggerated when they get right up close. On the other hand, throw in a long or telephoto lens that flattens the appearance of depth, and shoot the same subjects, walking the same distance, and their movement through depth seems slower, because their size changes very gradually, negating our expectation of movement and perspective. In other words, we can see they're walking, but it doesn't look like they're covering much ground. And that is focal length in a nutshell. Cut!
So focal length basically is the word to describe the lenses that they sell on the counter. So they measure from the center of the lens to the end of the lens when it hits your focal plane of your camera. And that will also determine how sharp your object is, because you need to focus your lenses to have a sharp and clear object on your viewfinder. Alright, so we're going to talk about focus first. You need to make your object sharp, and you can only do this if your focal length is set properly, and normally it's measured in millimeters. So say for example you have a lens that's 50 mm, and the focal length of the particular camera will be something like this. Okay, so you have the lens that's attached. So from this distance to this distance, that's the focal length. Let's say, for example, this is 50 mm. And at this point here, this is where the CCD chip of your camera will reside, and it will capture all the images. And this is the object distance that is in focus. Okay? So basically what it means is that the distance between the lens and the CCD plane in our video camera, that is the focal length. Now you don't have to worry too much about it, I just want to let you know. So when the lenses move further away, the focal length becomes longer, so the image becomes larger. Alright, it's just like a zoom in, zoom out. Now the drawback is that if you have a smaller area and your focal length is very, very long, like for example you zoom, less light enters the lens because the lens are pushed all the way towards the whole tube of the lens itself, the very long lens, so less light is entering. You must always remember the longer the lens that you get, for example, if you go buy a very, very long lens, chances are for you to have a very wide aperture is almost zero because zoom lenses don't have very, very large wide opening because of the nature that is made. Therefore, only medium lenses and wide angle lenses do have the ability to go like f1, f1.8. Okay. So as mentioned, we have very, very different type of lenses: normal lens, wide angle, and telephoto lens. This is how a normal lens looks like. Standard 55 mm, that looks and replicate what we see in the real world. Whereas a wide angle lens, it tends to push everything further back because now we can see things more on the left and the right of us. So wider lenses are like 28 mm, 15 mm. You can see a lot of stuff on the left and right of us. And it's kind of dangerous because that means if you have someone that's standing here holding the microphone, we might be able to see them if you change it to a wide angle. So it all depends on how you frame it. Now the opposite of wide angle is actually a telephoto lens or a zoom lens. That's where you zoom everything in. Now remember I mentioned to you that if you have a zoom lens, you really can't have a very wide opening because the lens is very long and very little light is entering. So let's look at some film examples and see how they manipulate their images through the lens. So let's look at this clip from Return of the King by Peter Jackson. Now I want you to take a look at the camera. It's using a normal lens for this particular movement because you notice that none of the characters are totally warped or their point of view is very, very abnormally large or anything like that. It kind of feels that we are there using our own eyes to see it, so it doesn't seem totally odd. Now the total opposite of that would be the use of a wide angle lens. Now notice over here, wide angle lens is needed because we want to see the landscape of the whole scene, and we can want to see the castle, we want to see the village, we want to see the mountains. So it's imperative that you use a wide angle lens because you want the audience to see the full landscape of the scene itself. Now this clip I'm going to show you is using telephoto lens. Now when you use a zoom lens, the chances of you having very shallow depth of field is very, very high. You can open up your aperture and you can only focus on one thing. In this scene, we're going to see that you can only focus the actors and the background itself is very, very out of focus.
His defeat at Helm's Deep showed our enemy one
So in this way, you can see the background is very blur. See, it's very out of focus, and what we are focusing on is only actor. This is only available if you have zoom in and you open up your aperture to be very, very wide. Okay?
He will raise Minas Tirith to the ground before he sees a king return to the throne of men.
So this is the end of part 2. We talk about lenses. Next part we are going to be talking about will be color temperature because that would be very important as to how you manipulate the color that comes into your lens and your film. Okay?